Welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. So I'm currently getting ready to take all my stuff and move it from here in Germany back to America after 5 years. And part of that is digging through my beer fridge and figuring out what it is I want to ship home and what I would rather just sit here and drink through first and not have to worry about getting through customs. And in the very, very back of my beer fridge, I found this Norwegian Yule, or their Norwegian Christmas beer, right? And it's brewed in the pale ale fashion. So I was like, that's probably something that I should just go ahead and drink now. But while I was getting ready to crack it open and just enjoy it, I started thinking, are there any Viking beer gods? And I was surprised to find, yes, there are. Kind of. So today I want to tell you about Ægir, the Viking god of beer. There's a lot of gods that persisted into the modern era, taking on new roles in the pop culture zeitgeist like Thor and Odin and Loki. But Ægir didn't really persist into the modern era. Not a whole lot of people know about him. And I think it has to do with the fact that he's a rather complicated character because he's a bit different than all the other gods. In fact, he is a Jotun and not a god at all, more of a giant. But to the ancient Norse people, Ægir would have been incredibly important because not only was he a god of beer, but he was the god of the sea or the ocean. In some mythologies and in some tales, he's actually like the physical embodiment of the sea, the living spirit within it. And the Vikings, they loved the sea. They were a famously seafaring people, right? So it would make a lot of sense that they hold Ægir in quite high regard. Ægir's role in beer and brewing is often overshadowed and overlooked by his arguably and justifiably more important role as the sea god. So I would like to shine a little bit of light on his dealings with beer and brewing. Ægir would often act as a welcoming or sometimes begrudging host of banquets and feasts for the other gods, likely due to how renowned his ale and mead were. When the gods wanted to throw feasts, they would reach out to Ægir, and sometimes it was a bit aggressive. They'd be like, hey, you're about to cook us up a feast and serve us some of your beer, and sometimes he's depicted as a very generous and welcoming host. But one thing I really like about Ægir is despite the fact that he was a Jotun, different than the other gods, right? He never saw himself as like a second-class citizen. He never saw himself as an other, he saw himself as on par with the others. So in those instances where the gods would kind of like force him to throw his feasts and brew his beers, he would throw a little sass back, a little pushback against them. In one of the sagas, Thor demanded that Ægir host a giant feast and to brew tons of ale for all the Viking gods to drink, right? So not feeling particularly up to the task, or maybe not like being bossed around, Ægir told Thor that he would certainly accommodate his festival if Thor was able to find a very specific brew kettle. And this brew kettle had dimensions that were so large and so vast that there would have been no way for Thor to be able to find it because it had never been made. It was just too big. But Ægir promised that if Thor was able to find this kettle, he would brew so much ale that he'd be able to satiate the thirst of all the gods, which is no small task since in a different saga, Thor once almost drank the entire planet's oceans. So that's a lot of beer. Now, as Thor went off on his adventure, I imagine Ægir was sitting there patting himself on the back, thinking he's so clever, like, haha, I finally got out of that one, don't have to do that. But eventually Thor returned with the kettle that met the dimensions that Ægir had specifically requested, and Ægir was forced to brew a whole lot of beer, so didn't work out too well for him there. Ægir would brew his ale with the assistance of his daughters, to great acclaim from Odin himself, who called it the greatest ale in all the 9 worlds. So as we can already see, Ægir had his connections to the world of beer and brewing because he was essentially the brewmaster for all the gods. But additionally, he was also known for throwing those amazing feasts and banquets. So annually, all the gods would come to Ægir's house, deep beneath the sea, right? And I like to vision this as like a traditional Viking alehouse just underwater, but as we'll soon learn, it was full of magic and mystique. Ægir's alehouse resides at the bottom of the ocean and was lit by the glow of gold he had acquired from the countless sunken ships that fell down to him. His kettles constantly boiled of ale and was always ready to drink. The ale horns repeatedly even refilled themselves. So renowned was Ægir's ale that not even the mischievous trickster god Loki dared to truly anger Ægir in fear of not being welcomed back into his house and not being able to drink his delicious ale, right? In one of the sagas, Loki had actually kind of gotten a bit rambunctious, a little too drunk, and ended up killing one of the servants of Ægir. Now, Ægir, being a truly gracious host, warned Loki that if he caused any more ruckus, he was going to be permanently banned. Loki decided that it was probably in his best interest to not cause any more ruckus and remained a polite guest throughout the rest of the evening. Unfortunately, not too much more about Ægir's brewing practices or his recipes or anything else survived in the modern day sagas. And unfortunately, tragically so, I wasn't able to find really any information at all about how the normal people, the brewers of mead and ale amongst them, how they worshipped or praised or even paid reverence or respect to Ægir. So it seemed that he was kind of like a secondary background character, which is so interesting to me since we know that beer was such a critical aspect of the Norse people's lives. Beer was a part of their everyday diet, and for their feasts like this Yule, they would brew special beers just for special occasions. So it was a critical part of Viking society. I just don't know why they wouldn't give more praise to the deity who set the example, who is the patron of that practice. And I think we should be grateful for what we do have, since that was his secondary role. And to add insult to injury, like I said earlier, he just never really persisted into the modern era. There does seem to be a little bit of acknowledgement towards Ægir in the modern day neo-paganism movement, but it definitely seems to be at a lesser rung, definitely nowhere up there with like Odin and Thor. But Ægir's legacy does live on. There are multiple breweries around the world that either brew beers inspired or named after Ægir, and there's even a brewery in Norway that's specifically named directly after Ægir himself. So in some small way, he does continue to exist. His legacy and his art form continues on in the modern era. And I mean, if this was like some type of Neil Gaiman American Gods type thing going on, I would like to believe that he's still kicking around brewing his ale and his mead and serving it to only the most worthy of drinkers. So let's all raise our goblets in honor of the Viking god of beer, Ægir, and may his kettles ever boil and may our horns always refill. Remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.